He built the first medical research institute in the United States. He funded the university that would go on to produce more Nobel laureates than most countries. He gave away, over the course of his life, more money than any private citizen had ever given away before him. Money that helped cure hookworm in the American South, that funded vaccines, that built schools for children who had been told their entire lives that they did not deserve one. Historians still argue that no single person did more to advance public health in the 20th century than this one man. The same man destroyed his competitors so completely that some of them never worked again. He built a company so dominant that by the time the United States government finally moved against it, it controlled nearly 90% of an entire industry that touched almost every home in America. He negotiated secretly with railroads to make sure his rivals paid more to ship the same product on the same tracks. He was, in the words of one newspaper at the height of his power, the most pitiless monopoly that had ever fastened itself upon a country. That man is the same man. His name was John Davison Rockefeller, and by the time he died in 1937, 3 weeks short of his 98th birthday, he had become both the most generous man in American history and its most feared businessman. The question this story asks is not which version of him was real. Both were. The question is how the same mind, shaped by the same childhood, produced both, and what that tells us about the difference between power that heals and power that consumes. Get comfortable. This is a long story, and it rewards patience. We begin, as these stories always must, in a house where nothing was ever quite what it appeared to be. Richford, New York, in 1839, is a town of fewer than 1,000 people, surrounded by hard, unforgiving farmland that yields little more than what a family needs to survive the winter. It is here, on the 8th of July, that Eliza Rockefeller gives birth to a son she names John. His father is not home for the birth. His father is rarely home for anything. William Avery Rockefeller, a man his own children will later call Devil Bill, calls himself a botanic physician. What this means in practice is that he travels from town to town selling bottled cures made from garden herbs, promising to heal cancer, promising to heal blindness, promising anything a frightened, sick person might pay for. When he is not selling false hope to strangers, he is loaning money to desperate farmers at punishing interest rates, quietly hoping they default so he can take their land instead. He disappears for months at a time. Then he reappears in a fine carriage, pockets full of cash, and showers his children with gifts they do not understand the source of. Young John grows up inside this contradiction, a house that is sometimes desperately poor and sometimes strangely flush, run by a mother who prays and a father who lies for a living. There is a specific detail that outlives every other memory of that childhood. John's mother, Eliza, once lost her own mother as a child, after a traveling medicine peddler sold the family a pill that killed her. She marries a traveling medicine peddler anyway. She will spend the rest of her life absorbing the consequences of that decision, and she will raise her eldest son to be everything his father is not: patient, disciplined, and obsessively honest in his ledgers, even as he learns, without ever being told directly, exactly how his father's dishonesty works. By the time John is 10, Bill Rockefeller is indicted for sexual assault, and the family flees Richford in disgrace. 2 years later, using a false name, Bill will secretly marry a second woman in a different state, maintaining an entire second family, while his first family believes him to be, at worst, unreliable. Here is the key: turn slowly. A boy who watches his father build an empire of false appearances and lies that no one around him can see, and who resolves, silently and completely, to build something of his own that no lie can ever touch. He will spend his life obsessed with facts, with numbers, with control, with secrecy, used not to deceive but to protect what he has built. He will trust almost no one outside his own ledger. Ask yourself, as this story continues, how much of the empire that John Rockefeller eventually builds is a mirror image of his father's, the same instinct for secrecy and control, aimed instead at permanence rather than deception. He is 14 years old when the family finally settles in Cleveland, Ohio. The country around him is about to change faster than any country in human history had ever changed before. And John Rockefeller is about to be standing in exactly the right place when it does. To understand what John Rockefeller becomes, you first have to understand the country that made it possible. A country that, in the 1850s, is expanding faster than its own laws can keep up with. The population of the United States in 1850 is roughly 23 million people. Within 30 years, it will more than double. Waves of immigrants arrive from a crowded Europe onto steamships bound for a continent that seems to have no edge. The frontier is pushing west toward the Pacific. Railroads are being laid across land that a generation earlier had no roads at all. And an economy that had been built on farms and small workshops is beginning, for the first time, to industrialize at a scale the world has never witnessed. Into this expanding, chaotic, half-regulated country comes a discovery that will define the next century of human civilization. In August of 1859, a former railroad conductor named Edwin Drake drills into the ground near Titusville, Pennsylvania, using a method borrowed from salt wells, and strikes oil. Within months, the region is swarming with speculators, wildcatters, and fortune seekers, all chasing a substance nobody yet fully understands how to refine, transport, or price. There is no regulatory body governing this industry. There is no meaningful antitrust law. There is barely a functioning national banking system. Prices swing from 10 cents a barrel to $14 a barrel within the same year, depending entirely on rumor and luck. It is, in other words, a landscape almost perfectly designed to reward a specific kind of temperament. Someone who is patient rather than greedy in the short term, who values control over speed, and who sees chaos not as a danger, but as an opportunity waiting to be organized. You have likely felt some version of this yourself. The sense that a new, unregulated space, whether a technology or a market, rewards whoever moves first to impose order on it. That is precisely the vacuum John Rockefeller is about to step into. The Civil War, breaking out in 1861, accelerates everything. The disruption of north-south trade routes redirects commerce through cities like Cleveland. Demand for kerosene as a cheap replacement for increasingly scarce whale oil skyrockets. And a 21-year-old bookkeeper, already known around Cleveland for his obsessive precision with numbers, is about to make the first calculated bet of his career. Not in the oil fields themselves, where fortunes are made and lost overnight, but in the unglamorous, overlooked business of refining it. The wildcatters are gambling on where oil might be found. Rockefeller is about to gamble on something far less exciting and far more durable: control of what happens to the oil after it comes out of the ground. History would prove that to be the more important bet by an almost unimaginable margin. On the 26th of September 1855, a 16-year-old John Rockefeller walks into the office of a small Cleveland merchant firm called Hewitt & Tuttle and is hired as an assistant bookkeeper. He does not know what he will be paid. He does not care. For the rest of his life, he will celebrate this date privately, calling it Job Day and treating it as more sacred than his own birthday. It is a small detail, and it tells you almost everything. This is a young man who does not measure his life by the milestones most people measure theirs by. He measures it by the moment he was finally allowed to prove himself with numbers. He arrives at 6:30 in the morning. He does not leave until well after 10 at night. He examines every invoice, every bill, with a thoroughness that borders on obsession, because he understands something that most of his peers do not yet understand. In a young, chaotic economy full of swindlers, an economy his own father has spent a lifetime exploiting, the man who controls the ledger controls the truth. He begins keeping a personal account book he calls Ledger A, tracking every cent he earns and every cent he gives away, a habit he will maintain for the rest of his life. And here is a detail worth sitting with. From his very first paycheck, Rockefeller begins giving away roughly 10% of his income to charity, to his Baptist church, to schools, to what were then called colored churches, eventually helping to purchase the freedom of at least 2 enslaved people. This is not a habit he adopts after becoming rich. It begins the moment he starts earning money at all, years before Standard Oil exists. Hold that fact. It will matter later when the story asks you to decide whether his philanthropy was calculation or conviction, because the truthful answer, uncomfortably, may be both at once. By 1858, still a teenager, he leaves to form his own commodities trading firm with an English immigrant named Maurice Clark. The two men need capital they do not have, so they adopt a simple trick. They walk around Cleveland loudly, announcing that their small firm is looking to invest $10,000, a wildly exaggerated sum, simply to convince nervous bankers that they are more substantial than they are. It works. The banks lend generously to 2 young men whose confidence outpaces their balance sheet. This is the first move in a career that will be built, again and again, on controlling what other people believe to be true. Sometimes through honest transparency, sometimes through carefully managed appearances. When war breaks out in 1861, Rockefeller pays $300 for a substitute soldier rather than fight himself, choosing instead to keep his growing business running and his large family fed. The commodities firm, boosted by wartime demand, clears $17,000 in profit by 1862, a fortune for a 23-year-old. He now has capital. He now has a reputation for reliability that money alone cannot buy. And in Cleveland, a chemist named Samuel Andrews is looking for someone willing to bet on an unglamorous new venture, refining the crude oil that everyone else is too busy drilling for to think seriously about. What Rockefeller builds over the next decade is not, at its core, an oil company. It is a machine for eliminating uncertainty. And once you see it this way, everything he does afterward becomes legible. The first piece of the machine is refining itself. In 1863, Rockefeller and Clark loan $4,000 to Samuel Andrews to build a refinery, treating it initially as a side venture to their produce business. Within a year, it is more profitable than everything else they own combined. Rockefeller does what his more cautious partner will not. He goes all in, borrowing aggressively to expand at a moment when most refiners are too frightened of the market's volatility to commit real capital. In 1865, in an auction the 2 men hold to settle their growing disagreements, Rockefeller outbids Clark for full control of the company by $500. That $500, he will later say, made his entire career possible. The second piece of the machine is transportation. Oil is worthless if it cannot move cheaply and reliably to market, and in the 1860s that means railroads. Rockefeller negotiates secret rebates, discounted shipping rates unavailable to his competitors, in exchange for guaranteeing the railroads a massive, steady volume of freight, 75% off the official rate from one line, a locked-in price nearly a third below the standard rate from another. His competitors, shipping the identical product on the identical tracks, pay full price without ever knowing why they cannot compete. The third piece is scale itself. By 1870, when Rockefeller incorporates the Standard Oil Company with a war chest of $1 million, the refining industry is drowning in its own success. So many refineries have been built that supply outstrips demand 3 times over and prices are collapsing toward worthlessness. Rockefeller looks at this collapse and sees not disaster, but invitation. What he assembles from that invitation over the following decade is a structure without real precedent, a network of refineries, pipelines, barrel-making plants, railroad cars and storage terminals, all controlled from a single office, all feeding information back to a single man who tracks the finances of his rivals as closely as his own. When individual states pass laws forbidding companies from owning subsidiaries across state lines, Standard's lawyers invent an entirely new legal instrument to root around it: the trust, a structure where a small board of trustees quietly controls dozens of legally separate companies. The word trust will become, within a generation, a synonym for monopoly itself. By 1879, this machine controls 90% of the refining capacity in the United States. It is not merely a company. It is closer to a private, unelected government of an entire industry, one with its own diplomacy, its own intelligence network, and its own capacity to make or break the fortunes of every person who depends on oil for their income, which by now, in an industrializing nation, is nearly everyone. To understand Rockefeller, you cannot simply catalogue what he did. You have to understand, seriously and completely, how he explained it to himself. Because he never once, in public or in private correspondence, described himself as a destroyer of competition. He described himself as its savior. His argument runs like this. The oil industry, as it exists in the early 1870s, is not a healthy free market. It is a suicidal one. Too many refineries have been built by too many undercapitalized men chasing a boom, and the result is a race to the bottom that will eventually bankrupt everyone, producers and workers included, when prices collapse below the cost of production. In a market with no rules and no restraint, Rockefeller believed, ruinous competition was not a sign of freedom. It was a sign of a system heading toward collective destruction. His solution, in his own words, was cooperation rather than competition. A single, well-capitalized, efficient organization absorbing the industry's waste and chaos and replacing it with order. When he approached rival refiners during the consolidation that critics would later call the Cleveland Massacre, he did not describe himself as an aggressor. He described himself, using explicitly religious language, as offering drowning men a place on the ark before the flood swept them away entirely. Those who refused to climb aboard, in his telling, were not victims, they were simply refusing to be saved. There is an uncomfortable amount of internal consistency to this. Standard Oil's economies of scale genuinely did allow it to sell kerosene more cheaply than almost any competitor could manage alone, a fact Rockefeller pointed to constantly, arguing that he was supplying cheap, reliable light to millions of poor American households who could not otherwise have afforded it. He personally interviewed employees in Standard's early years and knew many of them by name, and the company frequently paid above the industry average. In his mind, monopoly and generosity were not opposites. Monopoly was what made generosity affordable. This is the worldview of a devout Baptist who genuinely believed his wealth was a form of divine stewardship, entrusted to him by God to be multiplied and then redistributed for the good of mankind, a self-description he used sincerely for the rest of his life, calling himself, without apparent irony, a soldier of God sent to earth and given money for the benefit of others. It is also the worldview of a man whose father spent decades justifying fraud as a kind of rough mercy toward the desperate people who needed his fake medicine to believe in something. You do not have to accept Rockefeller's justification to recognize that he believed it completely, and that this belief allowed him to inflict devastating consequences on real people without ever, by his own account, feeling that he had done anything but save an industry from itself. Whether that is a philosophy or a permission slip is a question this story is not yet ready to answer. It will return to it later, transformed by everything that comes next. It is January of 1872. Cleveland's air smells of crude oil and coal smoke, and inside a modest office at the corner of Euclid Avenue, John Rockefeller and Henry Flagler, his ruthless, iron-willed business partner, are preparing to execute the most consequential 6 weeks of Rockefeller's career. The plan begins with a secret alliance called the South Improvement Company, a scheme negotiated with the presidents of 3 major railroads to double freight rates overnight for everyone outside the alliance, while granting Standard Oil rebates of up to 50%. Worse, competitors shipping oil through those same railroads would unknowingly funnel a portion of their own payments directly into Standard's pocket, a mechanism known as a drawback. The railroads would even hand over detailed shipment records of every rival refiner, giving Rockefeller a private window into the finances of every company he intended to destroy. The plan leaks before it can be fully implemented. Newspapers publish the story. Oil producers riot in the streets of Pennsylvania, tearing up railroad track with their bare hands, hijacking Standard's shipments, and threatening arson. Within 2 months, the alliance collapses in public humiliation. Here is the small, hyper-specific detail that historians keep returning to. Rockefeller was not humiliated by the collapse. He treated it, almost immediately, as a tool. The rumor that a secret cartel still existed between the railroads and Standard Oil, a rumor that was, by then, technically false, kept spreading anyway, and terrified independent refiners believed it completely. Rockefeller let the fear do the work that the failed alliance could not. Between February and March of that year, in a campaign that history now calls the Cleveland Massacre, Rockefeller quietly buys out 22 of Cleveland's 26 oil refineries. He targets his strongest rival first, a firm led by Colonel Oliver Payne, a Civil War veteran Rockefeller had known since high school, knowing that if the toughest competitor folds, the weaker ones will follow out of sheer terror. It works exactly as calculated. When Payne examines Standard's books and sees just how far ahead of the market Rockefeller already is, he sells, and later becomes one of Standard's most valued executives. Every owner who sells is given 2 choices, and only 2. Sign a contract permanently barring them from the oil industry ever again, or join Standard Oil outright. Most choose to join, which means Rockefeller does not just eliminate his competition, he absorbs its best minds directly into his own organization. By the time the dust settles, Standard controls roughly a quarter of the world's oil refining capacity, achieved not through a single dramatic battle, but through 6 weeks of coordinated psychological pressure on men who, in many cases, never even realized how thoroughly they had been outmaneuvered until they were signing away the businesses their families had spent years building. The 40-year war for the American oil industry has only just begun, and John D. Rockefeller has just discovered exactly how far fear, patience, and superior information can carry a man who is willing to use all 3 without hesitation. Momentum, once it starts, has a way of justifying itself. Each victory makes the next one easier, because each victory adds capital, information, and leverage that the last one did not have. By the mid-1870s, Rockefeller is applying the Cleveland playbook to Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, and the results are almost identical. Within 2 years of his arrival, only a single independent refinery survives in Pittsburgh out of 22 that had existed before him. Then, in 1877, the fight escalates into something closer to open war. The Pennsylvania Railroad, tired of watching Standard dictate freight terms, builds its own pipelines and begins acquiring its own refineries, directly challenging Rockefeller on his own turf. Rockefeller responds by redirecting his enormous freight volume away from the Pennsylvania Railroad entirely toward its rivals and by slashing kerosene prices to squeeze every refiner still loyal to it. The Pennsylvania Railroad is forced to lay off hundreds of workers and cut wages by 20%. The resulting anger helps ignite one of the most violent labor uprisings in American history, in which strikers in Pittsburgh burn over 500 freight cars and more than 100 locomotives. Rockefeller did not intend to start a labor war. But when you build a machine large enough to reroute the fortunes of entire regions with a single decision, the shockwaves travel further than you can see from inside your own office. This is the pattern that repeats throughout his career. A calculated business maneuver, aimed narrowly at a rival company, radiating outward into consequences for people who never appear in any boardroom. By 1879, having forced the Pennsylvania Railroad to the negotiating table and secured even more favorable terms than before, Standard controls nearly 90% of America's oil refining capacity and almost the entire pipeline network, connecting oil fields to cities. A vast web of pipelines now stretches across the eastern United States like the arms of some enormous creature, reaching into nearly every refinery, every railroad junction, every port. newspapers begin calling the company the Octopus, a nickname that captures something true about how it felt to compete against Standard Oil. No matter which direction you turned, one of its arms was already there. You have likely encountered a modern version of this feeling, the sense that a single company's reach into logistics, pricing, and data has become so total that competing against it does not feel like business anymore. It feels like trying to outswim the tide. That sensation is not new. It has a name, and that name is nearly a century and a half old. Standard's expansion into vertical integration deepens through the 1880s as Rockefeller pushes beyond refining into oil production itself, into pipelines, into storage, into the emerging science of removing sulfur from low-grade Ohio crude that everyone else had dismissed as worthless. Each new acquisition compounds the advantage of the last. And as Rockefeller's fortune swells past anything previously accumulated by a private citizen, so too does the scale of the opposition quietly gathering against him. Every barrel of oil that moved through Standard's pipelines had, somewhere behind it, a person whose life was reorganized by a decision made in a room they never entered. Consider the independent refiners of the 1870s. Men who had built their businesses from nothing, often with borrowed money and their family's entire savings, only to watch Standard Oil's rebates make their product structurally, permanently uncompetitive through no failure of their own making. Some of them sold to Rockefeller and walked away with enough money to start again elsewhere. Others sold for a fraction of what their companies were worth, having been shown Standard's books specifically so they would understand there was no version of the future in which they survived, and some did not survive the loss at all. Ida Tarbell, the journalist who would later expose Standard Oil to the entire country, grew up watching her own father's refining business destroyed by Rockefeller's tactics in the 1870s. His business partner, ruined by the same collapse, took his own life. Tarbell would spend decades of her career carrying that memory into every page she wrote about the company. There is a temptation, in telling this kind of story, to render the human cost only in numbers, market share, dollars, percentages. But a man sitting in a house he can no longer afford to heat, explaining to his children why the business his father built no longer exists, does not experience Rockefeller's 90% market share as a statistic. He experiences it as the specific, permanent disappearance of the life he expected to have. The human cost was not confined to the 1870s. Decades later, in April of 1914, at a coal mining operation in Colorado, in which Rockefeller's son held a controlling interest, striking miners and their families were living in a makeshift tent colony after being evicted from company housing. State militia and private guards hired by the company opened fire on the camp and set it ablaze. More than 20 men, women, and children died in what became known as the Ludlow Massacre. John D. Rockefeller Jr. had personally supported the company's hardline stance against the strikers, and his father backed him completely. It would become one of the darkest single events connected to the family name. A reminder that the instinct to crush resistance rather than negotiate with it did not begin or end with the oil business. It was a philosophy of power that outlived the industry that first produced it. None of this fits neatly beside the story of a man who anonymously funded medical research and helped cure hookworm across the American South. Both stories are true at the same time, about the same family, often in the very same decade. That is not a contradiction this story is going to resolve for you. It is simply the weight you are meant to carry forward, because Rockefeller carried it too, and by every surviving account, he carried it without ever appearing to buckle. Rockefeller's defenders, then and now, make an argument that deserves to be heard in its strongest form, not its weakest. Before Standard Oil imposed order on the industry, they point out, kerosene prices swung wildly and unpredictably, and roughly 90% of independent refiners were losing money in the volatile years before consolidation. Standard's efficiencies of scale genuinely did lower prices for ordinary consumers over the following decades, bringing reliable lighting oil within reach of households that could not previously afford it. Rockefeller paid his debts on time in an era when reckless borrowing was common, treated his own employees comparatively well, and gave away, over his lifetime, sums of money that funded medical breakthroughs saving lives on a scale that dwarfs almost any other private philanthropic effort in American history. None of Standard's tactics, defenders note, were illegal at the time they were used. The laws that would later be applied against the company, including the Sherman Antitrust Act, did not yet exist when many of its most aggressive maneuvers took place. His critics, making their own strongest case, point to a different set of facts that are equally true. Standard Oil's dominance was not built primarily through superior products, but through secret, non-public advantages. Railroad rebates, unavailable to competitors, drawbacks that skimmed profit from rivals' own shipments, and a private intelligence network built on data that should never have been shared. When the federal case against Standard Oil was finally decided in 1911, government investigators produced over 12,000 pages of evidence and more than 400 witnesses documenting systematic bribery of state legislators and a pattern of predatory pricing designed not merely to compete with rivals, but to destroy them entirely, in some regions achieving 100% control of the local market. That kind of dominance, critics argue, was not the natural reward of efficiency. It was the deliberate construction of a private power large enough to write its own rules, invisible to the public until journalists like Ida Tarbell forced it into the light. Both of these cases are supported by the historical record. Both were argued sincerely by intelligent people who examined the same set of facts and reached opposite conclusions about what those facts meant. This is not a case where one side was simply lying and the other simply correct. It is a case where reasonable people, looking honestly at the same evidence, can arrive at genuinely different verdicts about where efficient consolidation ends and predatory monopoly begins. A question, it is worth noting, that American courts, regulators, and economists are still arguing about today, in industries Rockefeller never lived to see. What can be said with more confidence is this: the very scale that made Rockefeller's philanthropy possible was built using methods that, within a generation, the American legal system would declare illegal for anyone to use again. Whether that makes his fortune a triumph of vision or a monument to a loophole history quietly closed behind him is a question this documentary is going to leave, deliberately, unresolved. For nearly 3 decades, John D. Rockefeller's greatest advantage was silence. He rarely gave interviews. He refused, almost as a matter of religious discipline, to respond publicly to accusations against him, believing that dignified silence was more powerful than any defense he could offer. That silence works, for a remarkably long time, as a kind of armor. Then, in November of 1902, a journalist named Ida Tarbell publishes the first installment of a series in McClure's magazine that will run month after month for nearly 2 years. She does not shout. That is what makes it devastating. Tarbell, whose own father had been ruined by Standard's tactics decades earlier, builds her case the way Rockefeller himself built his empire, patiently, methodically, document by document. She tracks down former Standard employees willing to talk. She obtains internal railroad records documenting the secret rebates. She lays out, in exhaustive, forensic detail, exactly how the Cleveland Massacre happened, exactly how the South Improvement Company scheme was designed, exactly how ordinary refiners across 3 states had been systematically starved out of business by a company most Americans had only ever known as the source of the kerosene in their lamps. And then, almost as an aside, her research uncovers something Rockefeller had spent his entire adult life trying to bury: the full truth of his father's past, the fake medicine, the sexual assault indictment, the secret second marriage, conducted under a false name, that had made John's own mother a legal bigamist's wife without ever knowing it. All of it, printed for the entire country to read. Rockefeller never responded publicly to a single word of it. He believed, to the end, that dignity meant silence. But privately, according to those closest to him, The exposure of his father's secret life caused him more anguish than any accusation ever leveled against his business practices. Here is the quiet cruelty of it. The very instinct for secrecy that Rockefeller inherited from watching his father hide an entire second family. The instinct that had once protected Standard Oil's rebates and rate schedules from public view could not protect the one secret he had spent his whole life trying hardest to keep buried. By the time Tarbell's series concludes in 1904, the American public's image of Rockefeller has been inverted completely. The mysterious, private businessman of the 1870s is now the national face of corporate greed, a caricature reproduced in political cartoons across the country. President Theodore Roosevelt, sensing the shift in public mood with the instincts of a man who had built a career on it, recognizes an opportunity too valuable to ignore. The government of the United States is about to do something it has never done before at this scale. Put the wealthiest and most secretive private empire in American history on trial, in public, for the crime of being too large to compete with honestly. By the time the case against Standard Oil reaches its conclusion, it has already outlasted the president who launched it. Theodore Roosevelt is gone from office. William Howard Taft, his hand-picked successor, has continued the prosecution with even greater intensity than Roosevelt himself. The scale of the case is almost impossible to summarize briefly. More than 1,000 exhibits, over 400 witnesses, more than 12,000 pages of testimony documenting, in overwhelming detail, the rebates, the drawbacks, the secret ownership structures, and the systematic bribery of state legislators that had built and protected Standard's dominance for 4 decades. On the 15th of May, 1911, the Supreme Court of the United States delivers its ruling. Standard Oil is found to be an illegal monopoly under the Sherman Antitrust Act. The court orders the company dissolved within 6 months, its assets broken apart into 34 separate, legally independent companies, corporations that will later become known to the world as Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, and Conoco, among others. It should have been the end of the story. It is not, because Rockefeller, retired for over a decade but still holding roughly a quarter of Standard's total stock, receives a proportional share in every single one of the 34 new companies created by the breakup. When these newly independent companies are opened to public trading for the first time in their history, freed from the shadow of antitrust scrutiny that had depressed their combined value, investors rush to buy shares in each of them individually. Within a few years, the total value of Rockefeller's holdings across all 34 companies is worth significantly more than his stake in the single unified Standard Oil had ever been. The government had set out to break apart a monopoly that threatened the American economy. What it accomplished, without intending to, was to hand its founder the largest single payday of his entire life. By 1916, John D. Rockefeller becomes the first person in American history confirmed to be worth over $1 billion. There is a callback worth pausing on here. In Section 1, this story opened with the image of 2 Rockefellers occupying the same body, the builder and the destroyer, the philanthropist and the monopolist. The breakup of Standard Oil is the moment those 2 men briefly seem to separate, in the eyes of the public, for the first time. The destroyer is punished. His empire is dismantled by the highest court in the land, a public humiliation 4 decades in the making. And in the very same legal decision, in the very same year, the same ruling makes the builder immeasurably richer than he had ever been before. History does not always deliver its ironies quietly. This one arrived in the same courtroom on the same afternoon inside the very same verdict. Step back from John Rockefeller for a moment and look instead at the system that produced him, because his story is not really an anomaly. It is a diagnosis. For nearly 4 decades, no law existed in the United States capable of stopping what Standard Oil was doing. The Sherman Antitrust Act, the primary legal weapon eventually used to dismantle the company, was not even passed until 1890, 20 years after Standard Oil's founding, and roughly 2 decades after the Cleveland Massacre had already made Rockefeller the dominant force in American oil. State governments that did try to intervene found themselves outmaneuvered by lawyers who had already invented an entirely new legal structure, the trust, specifically designed to root around whatever restrictions individual states could muster. By the time regulators caught up to the tactics Rockefeller had already used to build his empire, that empire had existed, largely unchallenged, for the better part of a generation. This is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath the entire Rockefeller story. The system did not fail to stop him because it did not notice what he was doing. Journalists, competitors, and even some of his own former partners loudly described his methods for decades before any government acted. The system failed to stop him because the laws capable of stopping him did not yet exist. And by the time they were written explicitly in response to what he had already accomplished. Rockefeller was not an outlaw who slipped through the cracks of a functioning system. He was, in a very real sense, one of the primary reasons that system had to be built at all. You may recognize this pattern from your own lifetime. Every era of rapid technological or economic change, the railroads of the 1860s, the oil industry of the 1870s, the digital platforms of the 21st century, produces the same lag between what a company can legally do and what regulators have yet learned to see, let alone restrict. The specific industry changes, the shape of the vulnerability does not. There is also something structurally revealing in how the breakup itself unfolded. The government's central goal was to prevent any single entity from controlling an entire market, and yet the mechanism it used, distributing ownership across 34 separate companies, all still controlled by the same shareholders in roughly the same proportions as before, did nothing to touch the actual concentration of wealth at the top. It redistributed corporate structure without redistributing power. Rockefeller's fortune did not shrink, it multiplied. What this reveals is not a flaw unique to 1911. It is a structural tension that persists in antitrust law even now. Breaking up a company's legal form is not the same as breaking up the wealth and influence that company generated for the people who built it. The oil empire ended. The Rockefeller fortune and the family's influence built upon it was only just beginning its second act. Walk through the world Rockefeller left behind, and his fingerprints are almost everywhere, though most of them are no longer wearing his name. The Rockefeller Foundation, chartered in 1913, still exists today, having distributed billions of dollars toward public health, medical research, and education over more than a century of continuous operation. The University of Chicago, founded with Rockefeller's initial gift of $600,000, has since produced dozens of Nobel laureates. Rockefeller University in New York remains one of the most influential biomedical research institutions in the world. When you take for granted that vaccines exist, that hookworm is not a common childhood disease in the American South, that research universities receive large-scale private funding at all, you are living inside an infrastructure that Rockefeller's money helped build from nothing. But there is a second inheritance, less visible and less celebrated. The Rockefeller family did not simply hold onto its wealth. It converted that wealth directly into American political power. John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s son, Nelson Rockefeller, served as governor of New York for 4 terms before being appointed vice president of the United States in 1974. Another son, Winthrop Rockefeller, served as governor of Arkansas. A grandson, John D. Rockefeller IV, known as Jay, became governor, and later a long-serving United States senator from West Virginia. The Rockefeller Center in Manhattan, built by John Jr. in the 1930s, stands today as one of the most recognizable commercial landmarks in the world, a monument to visible wealth that the notoriously private founder of the family fortune would likely never have chosen to build himself. When you hear a modern billionaire announce a foundation dedicated to solving disease, or funding education, or reshaping public health policy at global scale, you are hearing an institutional model that Rockefeller effectively invented. The idea that private industrial fortune, structured properly, could operate with the scope and permanence of a small government. And when regulators today debate whether a dominant technology platform has become too large, too interconnected, and too central to daily life to compete against fairly, they are having, almost word for word, the same argument that Congress and the courts had about Standard Oil more than a century ago. The language changes. Pipelines become data centers. Railroad rebates become preferential algorithm placement. The underlying question, how much control should one company be allowed to accumulate over the infrastructure an entire society depends on, has not changed at all. Rockefeller himself understood, better than almost anyone in his era, that a fortune large enough could outlive not just its founder, but the industry that created it. Standard Oil was dissolved in 1911. Rockefeller's name, his money, and his family's influence did not merely survive that dissolution. In several important respects, they never stopped growing. Here, finally, is the question this story has been building toward, not the one asked in the opening, but a harder one hiding underneath it. Rockefeller gave away, by conservative estimate, more than $500 million in his own lifetime, and the foundation he created has distributed many billions more in the century since his death. That money has measurably saved lives, funded the research that helped eliminate hookworm across the American South, supported medical schools on multiple continents, built institutions that continue producing scientific breakthroughs today. None of that is in dispute. But that money did not appear from nowhere. It was extracted, dollar by dollar, from a market Rockefeller had deliberately and knowingly cornered through methods, secret rebates, coordinated pressure campaigns, the systematic destruction of smaller rivals that the country's own legal system would eventually declare illegal. The philanthropy and the monopoly were not separate chapters of his life. They were financed by exactly the same fortune, built through exactly the same methods, often in overlapping years. So here is the question. If a fortune is built through methods a society later determines to be unfair or even unlawful, does the good that fortune subsequently funds redeem the way it was acquired? Or does the philanthropy simply launder the reputation of power that was never legitimately earned in the first place, allowing history to remember the hospitals and forget the men who were ruined to pay for them? There is no clean answer here, and reaching for one would betray everything this story has tried to show you. If you say the philanthropy redeems the monopoly, you are saying that sufficient generosity at the end of a life can retroactively justify harm inflicted decades earlier on people who never received an apology, let alone a share of the fortune their ruin helped create. If you say the monopoly forever taints the philanthropy, you are saying that the hookworm eradication campaign, the medical breakthroughs, the university educations funded for generations of students who had no connection whatsoever to the oil industry, should be viewed with permanent suspicion regardless of the actual good they produced in the world. Both positions carry real moral weight, and both, if pushed to their logical extreme, produce conclusions that feel incomplete. Perhaps that incompleteness is the most honest place this story can leave you. Every dominant fortune in history, Carnegie's steel, Vanderbilt's railroads, the great technology fortunes of our own era, will eventually face some version of this same reckoning. An accounting on one side of the ledger and a very different accounting on the other, refusing to net out to a single, comfortable number. John D. Rockefeller lived to be nearly 98 years old. Long enough to watch his own company be dismantled by the highest court in the land, and long enough to become, in the very same decade, the richest man the world had ever measured. He never once, in any surviving record, expressed doubt about which side of the ledger mattered more. The rest of us have had 100 years to decide whether we agree with him, and we still have not settled it. Return for a moment to a small red notebook. It sits on the desk of a 16-year-old bookkeeper in Cleveland, Ohio, in 1855. He calls it Ledger A. Every evening, by lamplight, he records what he has earned that day, down to the cent, and beside it, what he has given away, a portion, faithfully, to his church, to the poor, to causes he believes God has entrusted him to support. He does this before he has any money worth tracking. He does it out of a habit that will define every decade that follows. 82 years later, in a different room, in a house in Florida called The Casements, an old man is dying. He is 97 years old. He has, by then, given away more money than any private citizen in the history of the world. He has also built, and lost, the largest private monopoly the world had ever seen. Both of these facts will appear in the same newspaper obituary, printed side by side, without either one cancelling the other out. Think back to the opening of this story, the achievements stacked against the devastation, ending on a single sentence. That man is the same man. It was meant, then, as a provocation, a way to earn your attention for the next 3 hours. But having followed the entire ledger from that first red notebook to the final obelisk raised over his grave in Cleveland, the sentence means something different now. It is no longer a trick. It is simply the most accurate description available of what a human life, lived at that scale, actually looks like when you refuse to look away from either column. We tend to want our historical figures sorted, heroes in one drawer, villains in another, because sorted history is easier to live with than history that refuses to close. John D. Rockefeller does not sort. He built an empire by studying, more carefully than almost anyone before him, exactly where the rules of his era ended and where opportunity began. And then he spent the second half of his life trying to prove, through medicine and universities and quiet, anonymous checks, that the empire had been worth building. Whether it was worth building is not a question his ledger was ever designed to answer. It only ever told him what came in and what went out. Somewhere, in an archive in New York, that small red notebook from 1855 still exists, the earliest surviving record of a boy deciding, one entry at a time, exactly what kind of accounting he intended to keep with the world for the rest of his life. He kept it for 97 years. We are still doing the math.